Why does violence continue after conflict's end, and how can conflict be transformed? To help us explore these questions today, we have Dr. Gavin Mount, and he's going to speak on conflict transformation. This is part of our CoveTalk series, hosted graciously by the Cove and facilitated with the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess and the 2nd Australian Division. Just a quick note before we get underway is the views presented today are those of the presenters themselves and do not reflect the official position of the Australian Defence Force, the Army or any government organisation. And the material presented here are at the unclassified level. With that said, I'll pass over to our presenter, Dr. Gavin Mount.
My topic, as Jeremy said, is conflict transformation, and part of my background is a classicist, so I like to start off by just giving away the whole answer to my question. So what I'm going to be arguing today is essentially that peace is political, and I don't expect that what I'm going to be saying is going to be new to you. In fact, I think that you'll find that makes intuitive sense, but I'm hoping that some of what I give here provides some more conceptual grounding and some empirical grounding to some of those arguments. And I also hope that it brings some relevance to your professional outlook. I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners, and my way of demonstrating respect for this is to actually reflect on the humble, but I'm sorry to say endangered, bogong moth. The bogong moth used to be very, very prominent in our parts across our two regions of Canberra and Sydney and so on, and in fact its numbers are declining. The reason I'm mentioning it is because there's archaeological and oral history evidence that for thousands of years the bogong moth was, people came together for a festival when the bogong moth was in season to have a sort of big bush tucker event. But it wasn't just a nutritional event, it was actually a conflict resolution event. They came to solve their problems for thousands of years, the evidence suggests. And so I am thinking about this sort of deep knowledge, if you like, and the practice of conflict resolution, which has existed in these parts for many thousands of years. The outline of my talk will be to frame the concepts of peace and war. Well, I'll start with war and then peace. Now that's will be familiar to you in terms of how we might define war. But essentially what I want to do in that part of the talk is to think about how both of those ideas are inherently political acts. They're not ideas, and then in fact there's more similarity in some sense between war and peace. We might think of them as opposites, but in fact the fact that they are both inherently political acts is something which they have in common. I want to then quickly cover off on some of the empirical trends. In my own work, I teach in both geopolitics and in ethnic conflict, and also this area of conflict transformation. And I want to enjoin the two sets of data around geopolitical change over, say, 500 years, and also intrastate conflict, particularly over the last 70 years or so. And I'll be saying some things about the trends that we can observe there. And the point that I'd like to make there will be that we need to look at those two sets of data together. I then want to unpack conflict transformation. It's a complex field, and I won't do it justice, so I'm just going to be highlighting a couple of elements around the conflict transformation, in particular some of the sort of interesting areas of scholarship that have emerged that I think are relevant for this talk. And I'll look at a case study and I'll hopefully make some observations about some professional relevance. I do think that understanding peace and conflict transformation matters, and I think it's relevant, including for warriors. So, war. War is something which has a deep history, and we have, it's an organised activity, so we think about it, in fact, if we think about the original words in the ancient Greek of polemos, which means war, also we get the words for polemic, to sort of have a fight, a debate, and the words for politics. They're actually connected in the ancient Greek. Or the other idea in etymology of the Latin, vera, which refers to feud, we might think of a war as being something which is a feud or a fight, but in fact it's always been a rules-based activity as well, or a rules-bound activity. And so when we try to define what war is, we get people like Hugo Grotius defining it as a legal idea. Between juridical equals, and Quincy Wright similarly looking at it as a legal condition, equally permitting two or more hostile groups. Now, the other way that we define war is empirically. Singer and Small here talk about it as 1,000 battle-related deaths, for example. Now, there's some problems with these definitions, which I won't delve into. Thinking about war only in terms of juridical equals doesn't necessarily capture a whole range of types of conflict, or defining it just in terms of empirical ideas also doesn't capture it. For my purposes, I wanted to highlight a different sort of way of thinking about war, a broader definition that comes from a scholar on ethnic conflict, actually, Kumar Rupasinghe, where he thinks of it as a collision of projects. I like this idea because I think it draws upon this notion that war requires us to think of the ways, means and ends to mobilise the grand strategy, if you like, around war, but also how these projects are part of a sort of interests, values and identity. When we clash in these collisions of projects, there is resources, but there is also something in us as to our cherished values and what we're fighting for and what we're defending. And I think these elements are very important, and they help us understand the inherent political nature of war. Now, you'll be familiar with Clausewitz's definitions of war, and those at the back may not see it very clearly because I haven't got a large enough font, but you'll know it anyway. That war is an act of force to compel our adversary to our will, but it is also, according to Clausewitz, an act of policy, the continuation of political discourse or policy by the means. And so we have this notion of war as being inherently political in Clausewitz. I listened and watched Cian O'Driscoll's presentation on the Cove that was recorded here, and he talked about victory as a condition of war, and I wanted to sort of think about how we conceptualise war and the ending of wars. So if victory is our only understanding of what the purpose of war is, I think you may recall O'Driscoll talking about this and saying that that's a limitation. In fact, it might even undercut or undermine a just war framework, if that's the way we're thinking about it. Another person who looked at how the ending of wars is Gideon Rose. He wrote a fascinating book on the diplomatic history of the United States, How Wars End, and in it he demonstrates, and I'll put a quote up here if you can read that. In this book by Rose, what he demonstrates is that there is an enormous momentum around fighting a war which can really undermine the project of building a peace, right? Which becomes the political task, if you like, at the end of a war, is how to actually build that peace. But, and this quote here from Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, which comes from the experience of planning for the Iraq War in 2003 from the United States point of view, talks about how the planners were fixated on working out how to organise the resources to fight and win the war. And in fact, the notion that you would be planning for, preparing for the peace, almost undercuts that project. Why, who would do it? What fool would do it, he says, would propose hurting the war-fighting effort to address post-war conditions even before you've started that conflict. And yet, it's precisely that sort of planning that needs to be in place early if we are serious about transforming a situation and achieving some greater end. That is, some greater end other than victory. So what is peace? Let's see if my little thing works here. Peace, we can go through people like perhaps Johann Galtung, who is probably the world's most seminal thinker, thinking about peace. He talks about it as peace thinking. He talks about this as an umbrella concept, and he says We might think of it as something concerning the generalized good, and we see it in religions as well. And he says, whilst that's venerable, it's a limitation in terms of how it is that we can develop a more empirical and robust and coherent understanding of what peace is. He says that peace thinking is rarely original, usually vague, and often designated to glorify political agendas. And we'll come back to that idea in a minute, this idea that peace is inherently political and serves some version of ourselves which we want to impose onto others. Now, Galtung has suggested that, and through his whole career, he's a Norwegian scholar getting on now, but he's really dedicated his whole career to making peace a more robust concept, to developing our empirical understanding of what peace is. He talks about the idea of a negative peace and a positive peace. And we can think about peace historically through the lens of, say, a realist approach, which would say, well, we can achieve peace through order. Pax Romana, for example, an ordered system that controls and keeps us all at peace. Or we can think about the concert of powers, the balance of powers in the European period after the Napoleonic Wars as another way of achieving peace. These are mechanisms that essentially fall into that category of the negative peace. They are the absence of violent conflict, mechanisms to control violent conflict, but they don't take us into this other area of developing what he would call a positive conception of peace. And the positive conception of peace is a more ambitious idea which starts to think about how we might build a more coherent political community and so on. And some might say that's just too ambitious, but in fact he says it's important that we actually have in mind that more positive notion of peace. So coming back to this idea of how peace is in fact often framed as part of the purpose of war, we've seen this idea before. This quote comes from St. Augustine, where he talks about, for every man who seeks peace by waging war. And he also has in this quote this interesting idea that in fact the task may well be to change someone else's idea of peace. That when we're waging war, we're saying we're doing this in the name of peace, and there's this other fascinating phrase that he has here of invading the peace of others. He says even robbers, have their idea of what peace is, and he thinks about this. So this idea that peace is in fact framed as the purpose of war, and this idea that war is not some sort of argument against peace. On the contrary, it's an argument for my kind of peace over your kind of peace. So this is another way of thinking about the politics of peace, and it has a long, long history. The quote down the bottom here comes from Michael Walzer, from his essay, The Triumph of the Just War Tradition. And he talks about this idea here that says that just wars that are fought for a just cause, were appealing not just because they have a sort of a rightness about them, a moral argument, but because they served the practical and pragmatic interests of the political elite. Again, a political understanding of this, saying that the just war arguments were successful and triumphant actually because they served those political interests. The essay goes on to talk about how the military has embraced just war thinking, which he says overall is a good, but can also suffer from some of the hypocrisies that he says can occur with the political argument for supporting just war. Now, I'm mentioning all this because I want to situate war and peace as ideas that have a inherent political character. And that's very important, because if we want to think about how to understand conflict transformation, I think that those ideas are important to set up. So that's a bit of theory to start with, a bit of philosophy. Let me talk now about some empirical trends. We are currently preoccupied, quite understandably, with geopolitical change, and Some of you will be, well, many of you may well be familiar with Graham Allison, the Harvard professor's ideas of the Thucydides trap. Is that a familiar idea? It's essentially the notion that says if we track 500 years of history, what we find is that when there's been a status quo power and a new power comes on the scene, rises, in 12 out of the 16 cases there has been war, right? This is a concerning bit of information for us to think about. He says only on 4 occasions has war been averted. The good news, though, is that 3 out of those 4 cases have been recent. They've been in the modern era, and maybe that's something to do with a range of issues that we can think about. Could be economic independency, could be nuclear weapons, or it could be the rules-based order. Similarly, though, well, another bit of data that we can look at here is, and this comes from a team at Oxford and also Pinker's work, which shows a downward trend of great powers going to war with each other over time. So on the one hand, there's this situation which Allison's telling us that be careful because this can happen, but the overall trend is in fact great powers are not more inclined to be fighting wars with each other. And I would argue that one explanation for this could be that we have seen over this period a rules-based international order develop. Another one would be that economic interdependency, the fact that we've become more interested in working together for prosperity is an overarching trend which pushes against the idea of hegemonic or great power war. So we have this information here which I think is important for us to consider, and it's particularly important when we come to the next set of data, which is this graph here. I'll see if I can make it play. Can I make it play? Yeah, so this is a graph over from the end of the Second World War to the present, and what it's showing is the rate of intrastate conflict. There's a couple of things to note here. One is that there has been a steady incline of intrastate internal conflict over this period. And the most robust explanation for this is decolonisation. Decolonisation was a process which was quite disruptive, and if we think about that whole trajectory since the sort of 60s in particular, we see that trend. It's a good explanation for why that trend is genuinely going up. Another one is that we see it peak. At the end of the Cold War, the 1990s and so on, we saw it peak, and then we see it dip, it wane a little. And some would argue that the reason why it waned was because the rules-based international order, that is, and multilateralism, the UN and humanitarian intervention, and a concerted effort after the end of the Cold War to try to do something about internal conflict started to work. We had some nominal failures, like some very prominent failures such as Rwanda, but if we look at the general trend, we have that dip down. And the next piece of information I want to highlight is that green spike, and that's a really important one. What that refers to is an increase in foreign interference into interstate conflict. So, combining what we were looking at in the last slide, which was geopolitical conflict, going down over time, but we have reason for concern, think of Allison, because we have a new power emerging and a status quo power, combined with this information which says intrastate conflict is continuing to genuinely rise, but the really important factor here is foreign interference. And that we can read that as a high probability or evidence of an increase in proxy wars, such as what we saw during the Cold War and so on. So what we would expect now is large states, maybe not fighting direct conflict with each other, but through intrastate conflict, higher levels of activity. The Russians have a term for this, ethno-geopolitics, but I think we need to be very focused on those 2 pieces of data in terms of understanding the general nature of the empirical trends that are going on. So the other piece of information that's important in this data from the internal conflict, the intrastate conflict, is that most of these conflicts are not new. This graph, which is coming up rather badly on the screen, and I don't know if we can get a sharper image of that on the feed, But what it's showing is that whereas there were more new conflicts in the 60s and so forth, that correlates with this idea of decolonisation and so on, most conflicts that we see in the world today, internal conflicts, are recurring. That means that there has been a failure in the peace process. They are recurring because our efforts to sort of solve those problems has for some reason broken down. That's an important thing to recognise because it reminds us that we should be thinking about conflict more in terms of conflict dynamics rather than thinking about conflicts having neat middles, beginnings, middles and ends. It's not the case. The data's not suggesting that. And it's interesting also that this idea of conflict dynamics has been nicely transposed into whole of government approaches. There's a good example in USA. They use conflict dynamics to decide when and where and how to deliver aid. It's not a good idea to put aid into a situation where it's high levels of conflict. So they're trying to understand conflict dynamics. And this graph comes from the AFP and their submission in 2008, I think it was, to the peacekeeping inquiry that was done at the Senate. And what they were saying is that we have to make decisions on when the AFP as a material resource can be best deployed. And it's not a good idea to put our less armed police personnel into a high intensity conflict. What we're looking for is the conflict dynamics, so we are recognising that conflict has a sort of a operational continuum as well. And this is interesting as well because it connects our data with some operational examples. And I think that in the military we should be thinking that way as well. Certainly when we're engaging in whole of government, this kind of data I think should inform our thinking. So let me move now to making sense of this concept of conflict transformation. Conflict transformation, some regard it as quite distinct from the other fields, conflict resolution, conflict management, because it's saying, well, this notion that you can manage, resolve, completely fix conflict is a problem and it's a difficult assumption. The data doesn't bear it out. And so conflict transformation says, let's recognise that there is a story about change and conflict. It may not be a complete story. Peace may not be a perfect end. In fact, it might be some sort of continuation of politics. There are other issues that come with this notion of a moment of peace, like a peace treaty. Because if you think about it, if there's been a victory and there's a peace treaty, then that treaty may well represent a very uneven distribution of power. This can generate resentment and so on. Okay, so transformation says we need to take a broader view. We need to take a view that says it's changeable, and we need to take a more ambitious view which thinks about this in terms of how do we put in place the social and economic and political elements. Now it's been informed, this field, by a number of areas of influence. Ryan talks about the field of non-violence, of peace building as a concept which emerged to move beyond the traditional idea of peacekeeping, which during the Cold War was restrained to just monitoring existing peace treaties and then became a more ambitious project in the 90s. Globalisation, we have ideas such as Mary Kaldor's New Wars and a critical theory approach which says that we need to move a bit beyond just a problem-solving approach. So these are the influences on this field of conflict transformation. And it has this, again, this idea of thinking about how to match the different phases of conflict to different types of operational tasks. It's connected to other literature, such as the early warning literature, which has been quite effective around predicting things like genocides and politicides and so forth, based on some theory but also some empirical understandings. Some clever new techniques such as the Sentinel Project group, they have an early warning tool which uses crowdsourcing, hate speech and so on. So there's a number of tools out there which are informing this work as well. And prominent thinkers such as Zartman, who talk about this idea of thinking about the timing of conflict. When is the right moment for a peace? And are there other ideas such as a mutually hurting stalemate. So there's some really robust literature in this field informing it, and it's a rich literature, the conflict transformation literature. Other ideas are about what you do after a conflict phase, if you like, is subsided, or if it is in a conflict cycle, and that is dealing with the deeper grievances. So how do we build in things like truth and reconciliation commissions? How do we build in transitional justice? There's a debate going on around whether or not these ideas should come from outside, or whether you should go into the local communities and find local conflict resolution tools. So one example would be the Ubuntu practice in South Africa as a way of building the truth and reconciliation process, or the Gakaka courts in Rwanda. So these are local ideas. Now I want to sort of finish up, I'm not sure how I'm going for time, but good. I want to finish up with an example here. You can't see this table here, but I want to walk you through it because I see it as an example of what can happen in thinking about peace and what is I think a good example of a conflict transformation model. So it comes from the work of Anthony Reagan in the Bougainville peace process. Bougainville's recently, they've got some trouble there with a volcano, and they recently had their referendum and so forth. This goes back to the process where they had reached a mutually hurting stalemate with this terrible war, the Bougainvillean conflict, which had resource elements associated with Australia as well. And Reagan documents a process where, on the one hand, the Papua New Guinea government was, as he describes them, inflexible, very little flexibility on their position. On the other hand, though, the people in Bougainville who have been traumatised by a terrible 20 years of conflict, very, very visceral and close conflict of, relations and brothers and so forth fighting against each other, a difficult conflict, creating a very, very consultative process. The first thing they did was brought in the women. This region land is owned in a matrilineal arrangement, which means it's passed through women. So it's critically important that women are part of the conversation around peace. They brought the church groups in, and they were all involved in this conversation. So the next thing they did was they asked them 20 questions about politics, about how you're going to live your life, education, housing, health, all sorts of areas of life. And they said, you've got 9 options between no change at all and complete independence. And they respectfully engaged in a conversation with these people about all of those 20 by 9 options. And they came up with a middle position which said, we want our autonomy, but we don't want it all straight away because we're not ready for it and so forth. The point is, what you get out of this is an incredibly authentic and legitimate understanding of what a peaceful future might look like. It's a much more complicated and deeper understanding than some other versions of conflict resolution. And so I wanted to highlight that because I think that, and Australia's involvement in that I think has been a good one. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight out of that Bougainville case is that I think it has implications for the military. What I wanted to start by saying is that peace is a relevant topic for warriors, and that I think we need to be thinking about how it is that we plan for peace rather than just fighting for the war. It may well be that you think of it as someone else's problem, but I would argue that it is actually a big part of the planning, and it should probably be part of the training and so on. So how do we conceptualise this? And I think it's most likely to come in the form of the contemporary understandings of peace building as a project. Peace building, as I said before, is not just monitoring the peace, but it's a holistic approach that says, before you deploy, before you even go somewhere, who are the stakeholders that you're going to be engaging with and why, and how, mapping that out, and maybe even building those relationships up early. It's about getting people who are going to be involved in the post-conflict phase into the conversation at the beginning. I was talking to Jeremy in the car about an example of AusAid not being consulted early enough with Australia's engagement in Iraq in 2003. I heard that from someone from AusAid, and they were not involved in the early phases of planning. So we shouldn't be having our reconstruction teams and other kinds of people involved as sort of afterthoughts. They need to be early built into our thinking and planning. There was a study done by Gordon and Campbell for the Australian Civil Military Centre, which looked at 3 cases of Australia's deployment: Solomons, Bougainville and East Timor. And one of the things that they found in that study, and it was published with RAND as well, was that the military in particular expected these engagements to be shorter than they actually were consistently. They consistently underestimated. I can understand that because there's a sense in where you want to have an exit strategy. You want to hand it over to the other people. But I would suggest that we need to do better in our whole of government thinking, and we need to do better in terms of thinking about the politics of peace that is going to be in place after the fight's over. So that's essentially the argument. The pitch is that both war and peace are political, that we can actually, weirdly, think about them both as a continuation of politics by other means, even though we recognise that the state of war and the state of peace are different things. There is a sense in which those positive ideas of war and peace, Clausewitz and Galtung's version, are in fact very synonymous in some ways, which is a weird observation, to me at least. The other point is that the data tells us that there are reasons why we may feel a little less pessimistic about geopolitical change, but be aware that there is an increase in large states interfering in the conflicts of internal conflicts. And that is a dynamic which we can explain for a number of reasons why that might be the case. And it means that we're likely to look at proxy wars, grey zone and those kinds of activities. There's strong empirical reasons to think that that is going to be more increasingly prominent. That conflict transformation is a wider field of scholarship with very, very, very strong practical applications, and that we should be probably integrating the learning from that field more, I think, into our practice. And there are some prominent examples of things like conflict dynamics have actually been involved in shaping things such as an operational plan. And that the effective approaches to peace require much more sophisticated, a sophisticated, inclusive, authentic approach if they are going to actually achieve a lasting peace. This idea of planning for the peace is something which requires that deeper engagement with the community, and you need to resolve or address the issues of grievance, the deeper issues of resentment and grievance. Sometimes a constitution or a peace treaty can in fact do the opposite. It can fix resentment, which is the condition for the next war. So I hope that those ideas resonate with you and have some professional relevance, and I'm happy to take any questions.
A question from a Captain Malcolm, and it goes along the lines of, is the military prepared for these post-conflict environments? Should we do more training? Should we do more education? Those sorts of things. And I know you've already touched on some of these, and his question specifically goes to, because the Army's job is to contribute land power to conflicts in joint operations as directed by the government. So does Army and Army members, and maybe at what level, at the strategic, operational, tactical, at what level do those Army members need to know the bigger, broader project of conflict management and peace building, or is it good enough that at some level in that tactical through to the strategic, that soldiers don't perhaps need to know the bigger picture, they just need to focus on their part of the puzzle? But having said that, what are the advantages potentially of exposing soldiers to that bigger picture?
That's a lot in that one. So I think I've simulated Malcolm, which is good. Well, I would actually, I could start at the bottom, but I think I start at the top. The top, and also with our track record, right? So the top is, how does the ADF generally speak to the decision makers? So one way you can speak to them is say, look at our previous deployments, look at the character of those previous deployments, look at situations where we went in once and then we had to come back again because the job of peace wasn't complete. I think East Timor might be an example where we were back and forth. Here's the empirical evidence before you, government. We want to plan more effectively. So our plan now involves greater support. We admit we've been underestimating how quick these jobs get done and the task at hand. And we're going to learn from that, and we would like you to support us with some money. So that's the question about the top. His question was a really good one. To what extent is this useful, this post-conflict training useful for people training at different levels and different ranks? Well, I think we have to recognise that these skills of understanding what is affecting a community when you deploy, and it's particularly land power that we're talking about here, because you're coming up face to face with people who have deep grievances. And you could easily misread and misunderstand and make things worse by not having a deeper knowledge. So I would have thought that pre-deployment in particular, we need to skill up a lot more around what are those issues that are affecting the community to which you're being deployed. I think the training also should equip people with a greater sense of what the job's like. The job isn't just fighting a fight, and I understand the arguments of training down, but I think the job is also about managing and de-escalating violence, and part of that could be exacerbated if we don't have the right understanding about the nature of post-conflict engagements. So I think right through we need that training. I wouldn't take away other training jobs, and I always have these conversations, we have to train for the fight, what do we take out if you want to put this in? I think you have to integrate it, right? You have to integrate it into your whole training approach. And I think that the middle level in the military also have to think about how it is that they prepare people for the kinds of scenarios that they've experienced. So I think that the peer-to-peer learning in the middle of the organisation is critically important as well. So the top, the lower levels and the middle have all got a role for this, in my view.
We've got a question from in the room here.
Yes. Major Demelza Newlove. My question is around the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you could speculate, is this conflict a reflection of recurring breakdown of peace? And what do you think it will take to come to some peaceful resolution?
All right. Well, actually, I think, it's astonishing when you read someone like Augustine from 426 AD, and he says that in fact, war is not born out of a hatred from peace, but changing someone else's version of peace. Why does Putin refuse to call this a war, right? He calls it a special military operation because his version of this and the justification to his own people, insofar as that matters, it does, but in a different way, is that we are on the right path here. We are doing what is right for us. So Putin's understanding of that region and of Russia's place in that region and the world is that the breakup of the Soviet Empire was, his words, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, right? So for him, it's about that, in my view, it's about that deeper problem that needs to be resolved. So is it a recurring conflict or is it a new conflict? I think there's something new about the way that Russia is acting, but Russia has always been engaging in this thing that I've described before as ethno-geopolitics, right? So if you think about the Donetsk region and the Russian-speaking peoples and the arguments around self-determination, I'm not justifying this, I'm putting myself in the mindset of that. And what we've got here are two, not necessarily a war, but I mean, we do have a war, but we have two competing versions of what constitutes peace, which is a little bit confronting if you think about peace as a generic good. So there's a recurring element to it as well, though, I think. That region has been, whether it's in part of Russia or out of Russia, has always been a matter of contest.
We have another one from the audience.
Major Sarah-Jane Harding, reflecting on the first principle of war, at what point in our planning should we be planning for the peace?
Yeah. I'm so grateful to Gideon Rose and Lieutenant Colonel Peterson for sharing that insight about how, he said we were so driven by the argument of fighting the war. And what warrior wouldn't be doing that, right? How can we argue to the warrior that they shouldn't be planning for the fight and to win the prepare and to fight the fight? And certainly Clausewitz has that notion, and again at different levels. The soldier, the commander, the state have a different kind of orientation. I think the state, if you go to Clausewitz and his first principle, this idea of compelling your opponent to your will, but also the other idea of the continuation of politics. Clausewitz had a view of the state that was different from mine. He believed that the state was a perfectly rational creature that would always do, the right thing, I guess. I'm more suspicious when I look at our political leaders. But I do think it's the responsibility of government and the state and the decision makers and those at the level who are advising, who are having that conversation with our decision makers to commit blood and treasure. There is a very important question about what is your vision of peace. There's also an expectation, I would suggest, that you need to seriously entertain what is your opponent's version of peace. And is it possible that there might be some way of reaching some sort of reconciliation between those two versions of a political community? So I think there is a responsibility right at the beginning, before we make the decision, if you like, informing our decision. There is the operational task, which I'm not suggesting we should completely change, although there's something about the institutional momentum in Peterson's quote that should concern us, because the institution is so geared up around the function of preparing to fight and to win the war that it seems to be incapable of preparing and thinking about the peace. And yet we have to change the culture there in terms of our overall objective. I don't have an answer when, although I think it has to be very early.
Question from Wotu James Long, within 3 Brigade based in Townsville. So including some of this base level knowledge about conflict resolution and conflict transformation, potentially in mission rehearsal exercises and those sorts of things that a soldier will go through in preparation for deploying to a conflict zone, it could risk a bit of a stalemate or some doubts or contention in the mind of the soldiers before they go to those conflict zones. So if we're putting doubt in our soldiers' mind, is there a risk of firstly saturating a soldier's knowledge to such an extent that they lose some of those other warfighting hard skills that they desperately need to succeed in battle, but also could they potentially be at a point where they've got so much information they actually question their own purpose and potentially question their commanders whilst they are engaging in a fight, and potentially they choose not to fight at the worst possible moment, therefore undermining our own strategy and tactics at those decisive moments in a conflict?
All right. Well, that's a really good question. I do actually think this question is a question for the strategic narrative that is shaped particularly at the command level, right? And there are a number of levels of command, of course, but shaping that narrative is important. So what does this mean to someone at the tactical level? Well, let's take an example like Afghanistan, like General McChrystal's operational directive. He went to Afghanistan and he looked at the problem. He identified the big aim, the strategic aim of that mission to be legitimacy. And he made a tough command decision which said, I'm going to restrict close air support because my data is telling me that close air support is actually taking out too many collateral, it's causing too much collateral damage, and it's weakening our strategic objective, right? Which is to maintain legitimacy among the people. Now, whether you agree with this or not, but this is a decision he made. The point is, that flows right down to the tactical level, and the army officer, the army enlisted person who might be saying, okay, we have to do this now, but with less close air support. Why? Because our fight is a fight for legitimacy, right? So someone communicates that succinctly, in this case General McChrystal, with an operational directive and says, everyone, I want you all on the same page here. We have to understand that our fight is not with these people. Our fight is with particular kinds of enemy that we want to separate from the people, and we want to, in doing this, we want to maintain and build our legitimacy. If we do things which undermine our legitimacy at the tactical level, we're undercutting our strategic commitment. Now that to me is not inconsistent. there is a coherence to that narrative which you can understand at all levels of the organisation. So I think the challenge is getting our narratives right, being crisp, and being able to say there is a coherence in this. Yes, we have to think about how we're going to relate to the people. We're fighting a war among people, as Rupert Smith put it. So you need to think about that relationship in a sophisticated way. You will have to do that because that's the job. The job is, in fact, in an insurgency to actually make those difficult and sophisticated and nuanced decisions. And who does that job? The person at the platoon level, right at that level. That's the one who's actually face to face with these questions. And how do we equip them with that skill? We shape the narrative. We give a clean, clear, consistent and coherent narrative which helps support that person, and not to confuse them. Not to say it's one or the other. No, it's to say this is the one and the same. Right? We want to build legitimacy. That's our job in that case. There are other examples, but I think the task, and it's not an easy one, is the task of a commander and the command chain to articulate a clear narrative.
Yeah, we do need to think more about how we as commanders, military professionals, do create that strategic narrative and the golden thread of logic. And I would offer that there's a couple of good Cove talks earlier on in the year about how we do critical thinking in the military and how we relate the operational level of war through to strategic down to the tactical with a coherent narrative from strategy through tactics. We've got a question on the phone here from Captain Nathaniel. So what's the military's role after a conflict? Noting that we were talking a bit earlier about how we do the training and do the preparation. Do we need to educate or train people? But what are we actually training people for in this post-conflict environment? What are the key things that we should be focusing on?
Right. Well, I actually think that we shouldn't be leaving it all up to the military, and I think the whole of government approach pre-deployment needs to be a stronger culture of. So that question about what's coming next, there are some risks, and there's some examples of risks. For example, training. Dynacorp, the private military contractor, was involved in training in Bosnia, and yet that training was then used for nefarious purposes in terms of ethnic cleansing and so on. So we have to be very careful. Simply training and engaging in the military in a context, if we look at that graph of the conflict recurrence and the way that it was integrated by the AFP, they're very careful about thinking about when it is inappropriate for us to put police on the street, for example, not just in terms of their own safety, but you can actually be creating a secret police for a corrupt state if you haven't thought about that. So the problem with the post-conflict engagement is that if you are captured in some way or serving some kind of interests which are, you're not in control of, it's actually not a good thing. So how do we sort that out? I think we have to have, again, a coherent whole of government approach which goes right through, where the military plays an important role, but it also has an understanding of handing over different roles. The military will not always be the best tool for every job. And we also have to think about working with other partners, NGOs and other actors, for example, because, however we like it, we're not going in there as a neutral party. We're going in there representing Australia, right? And our cherished values, identity and interests. There are other actors that may claim and effectively achieve a greater level of impartiality and neutrality, right? And these are important actors, right? Because if we've actually been involved on one side of a battle and we are now involved in this reconciliation effort, we may not be the right people to send that message. So we need to think about those partnerships with other actors, third parties and other kinds of actors. I don't think it's all up to one actor to do that. As to how we train and what we're delivering in that training, be careful. And again, the answer to that question is an inherently political one. If the organisation, the new state, the government, say it's been rushed together. After Iraq, we had that process of de-Baathification. We got rid of all the public servants and everything else. Was that a legitimate government? Probably not seen as legitimate. The constitution wasn't right. And we saw this in Afghanistan as well, right? So we're contributing to that state, but that state doesn't have the legitimacy that, we would hope. So we have to be cautious about being captured and contributing to something which is like not consistent with our intention for being there. And sometimes that might mean we have to pull out. The Dutch made a decision in Afghanistan. You know, they had the terrible experience of Srebrenica where they got caught up in that situation. I believe that was very related to why they had a limited approach in Afghanistan. Some criticised it. Others said they went in with a clear mission and they had a way of getting out of that. So sometimes we might have to make tough decisions about why we're there and how we can best serve our understanding of our, projection of our values into the world. Tricky question.
Appreciate everybody online and on the audience, and also extend my thanks to the Cove for facilitating this. And I just offer that if you do follow the Cove on your social media through Facebook and on the website, you'll find the next presentations. And I'll see you on the next last Tuesday of the month, PME. And for those of you in the room here, I'd like you to offer your appreciation in the usual way for Dr. Gavin Mount. Thank you very much.